The smoke hit Emma Wilcox before the smell did. She was standing at her kitchen window with a cup of coffee going cold in her hands when the orange glow painted the night sky south of her property line, and for one suspended, breathless second, she thought it was a neighbor's lantern caught in the wind. Then the glow doubled. Then it roared. Emma dropped the cup. It shattered on the floor. She did not look down. She was out the door in her nightgown, her bare feet hitting the frost-stiff grass of the yard before her mind had fully caught up with what her body already knew. The haystack. The one she had spent the entire summer building, bale by painstaking bale, the one that represented every ounce of food her cattle would need to survive the brutal Kansas winter that was already pressing its cold thumbs against the plains. Gone. Already gone. The flames were 40 feet high and climbing, and even from 200 yards she could feel the heat pressing against her face like a brand. She ran until her lungs burned and her feet bled, and she stood before the inferno with nothing in her hands and nothing she could do, and that was when she saw it. The boot print. Fresh in the frost at the edge of her south fence line, pressed deep into the half-frozen soil, and beside it a fragment of oilcloth that had not been there yesterday. She had walked this fence just after sundown. She knew what belonged on her land. She picked up the oilcloth. She pressed it to her chest, and she stood there in the roaring dark watching 3 months of survival burn to ash, and the name that rose to her lips was not a prayer and not a plea. It was a name she had not spoken aloud in 6 months, but it lived in her like a splinter she could not reach. Fletcher Crane. She had known Fletcher Crane for 4 years, ever since she had arrived in Harlow Creek, Kansas, in the spring of 1883, a widow of 27 with a deed to 160 acres, and a determination that people in town had called impressive to her face and foolish behind her back. She had heard both assessments clearly and had chosen to believe neither. She had broken her own ground. She had planted her own grass seed and built her own fences and negotiated her own contracts at the feed store. And when men tried to underprice her cattle at market, she had stood at the auction rail with her arms crossed and her jaw set and waited them out every single time. Fletcher Crane had wanted her land from the beginning. He was the largest landowner in Cedar County, a man of 42 with soft hands and hard eyes, and he had made her 3 offers in 4 years, each one framed as a favor, each one carrying the quiet suggestion that a woman alone on the plains was an accident waiting to happen. She had refused him 3 times. After the 3rd refusal, his manner had changed in ways that were difficult to point to directly but impossible to miss, the way the manner of a man changes when he has decided that patience has its limits. Her best irrigation channel had run dry 2 summers ago. She had blamed drought. Her best bull had gone lame the following spring. She had blamed bad luck. 3 of her fence posts along the property line shared with Crane's land had been found sawed halfway through in August, and that she had not been able to blame on anything but what it was. She had reported the fence posts to the county sheriff, a pleasant man named Aldous Briggs who had nodded and written things down and done nothing that she could see. She had no proof of who had sawed the posts. She had suspicion, which was not the same thing. Now she had an oilcloth and a boot print, and a haystack that was nothing but coals and grief. And the first frost of 1887 was 12 days away at the most. She had checked the sky every morning for 2 weeks and she knew what was coming. Without that hay, her cattle would not make it through January. Without her cattle, there was no ranch. Without the ranch, there was only the deed to 160 acres of Kansas grassland that Fletcher Crane would be happy to purchase at a price he decided was fair. Emma Wilcox stood in the dark with ash falling in her hair, and she made herself a promise. She was not going to lose this land. But standing in front of a dying fire and making promises to herself was not the same as knowing how to keep them, and by the time the flames had burned themselves down to a sullen orange glow, she was trembling with cold and exhaustion, and something that was close to despair, but that she refused to call by that name. She went back to the house. She swept up the broken cup. She put on her boots and her heaviest coat. And then she sat at the kitchen table with a piece of paper and a pencil and began writing down every person in Harlow Creek who might be willing to help her cut and haul enough hay to survive the winter, calculating the numbers with the same practical ferocity she applied to everything, because that was who she was. She was a woman who did not sit down for long. By morning she had a list of 7 names. By afternoon she had crossed off 5 of them. The 2 remaining were her neighbor Beatrice Halford, who was 63 and had a bad hip, and a man she had met exactly once at the grain exchange 3 weeks earlier, Cornelius Collier. She had not paid him particular attention at the time. He had been standing behind her in line at the exchange counter, a tall man with dark hair going silver at the temples and a quiet way of holding himself that was not still so much as contained. The way a river is contained by its banks, but you are always aware of the current running beneath. He had been in Harlow Creek for about a month. She knew from the things people said when they thought she was not listening. He had taken a job at the Brennan spread outside of town, doing general ranch work, and the word was that he was skilled and steady, and not given to conversation unless conversation was warranted. She had turned around at the grain counter because she had dropped her pencil and he had picked it up and handed it back to her without being asked, and she had said thank you, and he had nodded, and that had been the entirety of their interaction. It was not. She reflected now with her list on the table and the smell of ash still in her hair, the most promising foundation from which to request emergency assistance. She went anyway. The Brennan spread was 4 miles east of her property, a well-kept operation with a red barn and 3 working dogs who came out barking when her wagon rolled through the gate. Tom Brennan was a decent man, 50s, who had always been fair to her at market. He met her in the yard with his hat in his hand and his expression careful when she explained what had happened. "Lord above, Emma," he said, "you certain it was set deliberate? The boot print was fresh," she said. "The oilcloth was not mine." Tom Brennan pressed his lips together and looked at the sky the way men in Kansas always looked at the sky when they were thinking about things that were happening on the ground. "I can lend you my boy Marcus for a few days," he said. "He is strong. But I cannot spare him longer than that with the fencing we have got to do before frost." "I understand," Emma said. "I was also hoping I might speak with Cornelius Collier." Tom Brennan looked at her. "Nell is out in the south pasture." "Nell. That is what we call him. You are welcome to ride out." She found him mending a fence line half a mile into the pasture, working alone with his sleeves rolled up despite the cold, moving with an efficiency that was clearly the product of years rather than effort. He heard her horse approaching and turned before she was close enough that most people would have noticed the sound, which told her something about the kind of attention he paid to the world around him. "Miss Wilcox," he said. She was mildly surprised he remembered her name from one brief exchange. She did not let it show. "Mr. Collier, I have a situation. I would like to explain it to you, and if you are willing to help, I will pay fair wages for your time over and above whatever Mr. Brennan is paying." He set down the fencing pliers. He looked at her with gray eyes that were direct without being intrusive, and he said, "Tell me the situation." So she told him, all of it. The fire, the boot print, the oilcloth, the 12 days before frost, the 6 head of cattle she needed to carry through winter, the hay she needed to replace, and the fact that every farm within 20 miles was likely to be guarding their own stock now that winter was pressing in. She told him about Fletcher Crane and the 3 offers and the sawed fence posts, and she told him about Sheriff Briggs and the notebook and nothing done. She told him calmly and completely, the way she told herself everything, without ornamentation and without apology. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. A meadowlark called somewhere in the dry grass, and the wind moved through the fence wire with a low, lonely sound. "How many days would you need?" he asked. "If we had enough hands and the right equipment, 4 days of hard cutting could build a stack sufficient to carry through February, provided the winter is not exceptional." "Who else do you have?" "Marcus Brennan for 3 days. My neighbor Beatrice Halford can cook for us and manage the cattle. I have the equipment. 4 people cutting is enough if we start before dawn. Can you get away from here?" He looked back toward the ranch house in the distance. "I will speak to Mr. Brennan today." Emma felt something shift in her chest, a small movement like a door opening just slightly in a room that had been closed for a long time. She did not examine it too closely. "I can offer you $3 a day above your current wages," she said, "and meals." $2 is sufficient," he said. "Keep the difference against what you will need this winter." She wanted to argue and stopped herself, because she recognized the simple logic of what he had said, and she was not so proud that she would argue against her own financial interest. "All right," she said. "Can you be at my place by 5 tomorrow morning?" "I will be there by 4:30, he said. He was there at 4:15. She had already been up for an hour. He came alone that first morning, before Marcus Brennan arrived. And while Emma was loading the flat wagon with her cutting equipment, Cornelius Collier walked the length of her south field without being asked, and came back with a clear-eyed assessment of where the best cutting would happen, and in what order they should work the sections to maximize efficiency. She had already done this calculation herself, and his answer was the same as hers, and this fact produced in her a sensation that was close to relief, the specific relief of not having to explain yourself to someone who already understands. They worked through the first day in near silence, broken only by what was necessary. He did not talk to fill space. She did not either. They were well matched in this way. Marcus Brennan arrived at 7 and was cheerful and strong and 20 years old, and not at all experienced in the kind of focused, sustained work that Emma and Cornelius had already established as the rhythm of the day. Cornelius showed him without comment and without condescension how to position the cutter for maximum take, and Marcus adjusted quickly because he was a good-natured young man, and because Cornelius Collier had a way of teaching that was entirely devoid of impatience. Emma watched this from across the field and understood something about the man that no amount of direct conversation would have told her. That evening, when Marcus had gone home and the work was paused, Emma made supper on the cast-iron stove. Salt pork and boiled potatoes and cornbread, simple food made with the same attention she gave everything. Cornelius ate without complaint and with evident appreciation, which she marked privately as a point in his favor. She had known men who thought that good food prepared by a woman was simply the natural order of the world and required no acknowledgement. Cornelius said the cornbread was excellent, and he said it the way a person states a fact. "Where did you work before Brennan's?" she asked. "Colorado," he said. "Before that, Wyoming. Before that, I was in Texas for 8 years. Ranch work all the way through, mostly." He poured himself another cup of coffee from the pot she had left on the stove. "I had a place of my own in Colorado for 2 years. She looked up from her plate. "What happened to it?" "Bad winter and a worse business partner." He said it without apparent bitterness, just as information. "I walked away from the debt rather than fight it in a court system that was not going to find in my favor. That particular county had particular arrangements with particular judges." Emma understood this immediately and completely. The legal system in frontier counties was not always a system of law so much as a system of whoever had gotten there first and made the right friends. She had navigated its edges herself in the matter of the fence posts. "Is that why you are moving around?" she asked. "Partly. Partly I am looking for something that is worth staying for." He said this without looking at her, in the same even tone he used for everything, and she felt the words land somewhere they had not been aimed at, or at least somewhere she had not intended to stand. She moved back from that feeling carefully. "Fletcher Crane has been a neighbor of mine for 4 years, she said, returning to safer ground. "He has resources and connections in this county that make the legal route difficult for me. The sheriff is not corrupt, I do not believe, but he is cautious in a way that tends to benefit the people with the most land. What are you planning to do about him?" "Right now I am planning to rebuild my haystack. And after that," she looked at him across the table, "I am still working on after that." Something moved through his gray eyes that might have been respect, or might have been something less easily named. He nodded slowly. "One problem at a time," he said. "That is exactly right." The second day was harder and colder, with a wind coming down out of the northwest that had teeth in it, the kind of wind that carried the news of what was coming even if you had not yet checked the calendar. Emma worked until her shoulders ached and her hands were stiff inside her leather gloves, and she did not stop. Cornelius Collier worked beside her with an endurance that was remarkable, not because it was dramatic, but because it was utterly steady. He did not have the explosive energy of youth. What he had was something more useful in a long contest, a deep reservoir of determination that did not appear to have a bottom. By noon of the second day, they had cut and stacked enough to make Emma's original calculations look pessimistic. She revised them upward and they kept working. During the break for the midday meal, Marcus Brennan, who was an observant young man despite his easy manner, said something that Emma filed away without responding to. "You two work together like you have been doing it for years," Marcus said cheerfully, biting into the bread Beatrice Halford had sent over. "It is strange to watch." Emma handed Cornelius the water bucket without comment. He took it without comment. Marcus watched this with an expression of quiet amusement and said nothing further. Beatrice Halford came by that afternoon, ostensibly to bring more bread and to check on the cattle, but actually to have a look at Cornelius Collier. Emma recognized this immediately because she had known Beatrice for 4 years, and Beatrice was not subtle about the things she wanted to assess. She walked around the field perimeter until she had a clear view of the two of them working, and then she came to find Emma at the water trough. "He is a careful man," Beatrice said, which from Beatrice was high praise. "He is a useful one," Emma said, which from Emma was also high praise, though she was less willing to admit what else she might mean. "He is not hard to look at either," Beatrice added, because Beatrice was thorough. "Go check on the cattle," Emma said. Beatrice went, laughing to herself. On the evening of the second day, when Marcus had gone home and the light was going orange and cold in the west, Cornelius helped Emma cover the new stack with canvas against the weather. They worked around it in opposite directions, tucking and staking, and they met on the south side in the last light and stood closer together than they had been before, close enough that she could see the exact color of the fatigue and satisfaction in his face. "We are going to make it," he said, looking at the stack. "Yes," she said, "we are." Then he looked at her, and for a moment neither of them said anything, and the wind moved the dry grass around them, and the sky in the west was the color of embers, and Emma Wilcox felt something she had not felt in a long time, something she recognized the way you recognize a song you learned as a child that you thought you had forgotten entirely. She looked away first. She went back to the house. She told herself it was the wind making her feel warm. Fletcher Crane appeared on the third morning. He rode up the drive at 9 o'clock on a gray horse, unhurried, dressed well, with 2 of his ranch hands behind him at a polite distance. Emma was at the stack when she heard the hooves, and she straightened and turned and felt the cold that moved through her had nothing to do with the November air. Cornelius, 20 feet away, also straightened and also turned. He did not move toward her, but his whole posture changed in the way a river changes when the channel narrows. Fletcher Crane stopped his horse at the edge of the work area. He looked at the new stack, which was already substantial, and then he looked at Emma with an expression that carried several things at once: surprise, displeasure, and the controlled version of each that was his preferred social face. "Emma," he said, "I heard about your trouble. I came to offer my condolences." She felt the oilcloth in her apron pocket. She had kept it there every day. "That is very considerate of you, Fletcher," she said. "I also came to make a fresh offer," he said. "In light of your situation, I think you will find it more than fair." "In light of my situation," she repeated. "A woman alone, this close to winter, with a setback of this magnitude. It might be the right time to consider a simpler arrangement." Emma looked at him for a long moment. She was aware of Cornelius behind her, aware of the 2 ranch hands behind Crane, aware of the wind in the grass and the weight of everything she had built on this 160 acres over 4 years of absolute solitary effort. "I am not alone," she said, "and my situation is managed. Thank you for riding out." Crane's eyes moved to Cornelius, and the calculation in them was immediate and unhidden. "I do not believe I have had the pleasure," he said. Cornelius said his name simply, without offering anything more. He had a way of giving his name that was entirely civil and entirely closed, and Crane received it as such. "Well," Crane said after a pause that was not quite as smooth as he would have liked, "the offer stands. You know where to find me." He looked back at Emma, and his eyes were cold in the way that is more honest than warmth. "The winter is going to be a hard one." "They always are," Emma said. "Good day, Fletcher." He turned his horse and went, and the 2 ranch hands followed him, and Emma watched them until they were through her gate. Then she exhaled. She turned around, and Cornelius was watching her with those level gray eyes. "How often does he do that?" he asked. "The visits, less often now than before. He is used to me refusing. He did not expect to find someone else here." "No," she said, "he did not." Cornelius was quiet for a moment. "The oilcloth," he said. "Do you have it?" She pulled it from her apron. He held out his hand, and she gave it to him, and he turned it over, studying the pattern of the weave and the specific staining on one edge, an oil stain of a particular color that looked more like lamp oil than axle grease. "This is not standard ranch supply," he said. "This is from a general store. The dye in the weave is a particular blue that I have only seen from one supplier." She stared at him. "How do you know that?" "I spent 8 years in Texas working cattle drives," he said. "You pay attention to goods and where they come from when you are a long way from anywhere. This blue comes from a dye that Hartley and Sons of Abilene distributes. There are 2 stores in Cedar County that carry Hartley goods." Emma felt something sharp and bright move through her. "The one in town is owned by Curtis Hale. Curtis Hale plays cards with Fletcher Crane every Friday." "That is useful information," Cornelius said, handing the oilcloth back. "It is not proof." "No. But it is a piece of something that might become proof." She looked at him. She looked at him in the particular way that you look at someone when you are revising your initial estimate of them significantly upward and you are not entirely sure how to manage that. "Why are you helping me with this?" she asked. "The hay is one thing. You are being paid for the hay. This is something else." He met her eyes, and the answer he gave her was not the one she expected. "Because what was done to you was wrong," he said, "and that ought to be enough of a reason." Emma Wilcox had been on her own long enough that simple, uncomplicated honesty had the effect of a physical force. She turned away from him and picked up her tools and went back to work, because that was what you did when something moved through you that you were not ready to sit with directly. They finished the new stack on the 4th day, Marcus Brennan's last day, and the young man went home exhausted and pleased with himself, which was exactly the right way for a 20-year-old to feel after 4 days of serious work. Beatrice Halford came to look at the completed stack and pressed her hands together and said something quietly to herself that Emma could not hear, but her expression was one of profound relief. Emma stood before the finished stack as the light failed on the 4th day and the cold came down with authority, the real cold now, the kind that did not apologize. She could feel the temperature dropping by the minute. The stack was covered and weighted and staked, and it was enough. It was enough to carry her cattle through winter. She had done it. She felt tears at the back of her eyes and refused them. She had promised herself 4 years ago that she would not cry over this land when there was still work to be done, and there was always still work to be done. Cornelius came to stand beside her, not close enough to crowd, but close enough that his presence was a clear thing in the cold air. "You built that in 4 days," he said. "Most people would not have thought it could be done." "I am not most people," she said. "No," he agreed. "You are not." She looked at him sideways. The last light was on his face, picking out the silver at his temples and the lines around his eyes, and the fact that his nose had been broken at some point and healed slightly crooked, which she had not noticed before. He was 34 years old. She knew from things Tom Brennan had said, and he looked exactly 34, which was not young and was not old but was the age at which a person has accumulated enough experience to be genuinely useful, and has not yet accumulated enough bitterness to be generally difficult. She thought about the 2 years he had spent building his own place in Colorado and what it must have felt like to walk away from it. She thought about what it meant to be the kind of person who could say a bad winter and a worse business partner without any apparent self-pity, and still get up before 4:30 in the morning to help a woman he barely knew cut hay against the frost. She thought about all of this, and then she said, "I would like to offer you a proper supper as a final payment if you can stay." He said yes. Beatrice Halford stayed too, because Beatrice was incapable of leaving while there was interesting company present, and the four of them sat around Emma's kitchen table with roast chicken and biscuits and sweet potato, and the conversation moved from practical things to other things, the way conversation does when the practical things have been resolved and there is food and warmth to encourage it. Cornelius talked about Colorado, the mountains and the way the light fell in autumn, the particular quality of the air at elevation. He talked about it the way a person talks about a place they genuinely loved, and Emma listened with more attention than she showed. Beatrice asked him straightforward questions about his history and intentions in the way that only women over 60 feel authorized to do, and he answered them without apparent offense, which told Emma that he had nothing in his history he was embarrassed by and nothing in his intentions he was hiding. "Are you planning to stay in Harlow Creek?" Beatrice asked, as direct as a post and twice as solid. "I have been thinking about it," he said. He did not look at Emma when he said this, and Emma did not look at him, but the temperature in the room changed anyway. "This is a good county," Beatrice said in the tone of a woman who is issuing both information and encouragement simultaneously. "Once you get past the Fletcher Cranes of the world." "Every county has its Fletcher Cranes," Cornelius said. "The question is whether the right things are in place to hold them accountable." "What sort of things?" Emma asked. "Evidence," he said, "and someone willing to push it." He stayed late. Beatrice eventually drove herself home in her small buggy, waving from the seat without turning around, as though she knew something the other two had not yet admitted to themselves. Emma walked Beatrice to the gate, and when she came back to the house, Cornelius was washing the dishes in the basin, which was not something she had asked him to do and was not something she expected, and the sight of it did something to her that she was wholly unprepared for. She stood in the doorway and watched him work for a moment, and thought about what she was feeling in the clear-eyed, analytical way she thought about most things, and what she concluded was that she was in real trouble. Not the kind of trouble that was Fletcher Crane, a different kind entirely, the kind that did not have obvious remedies and that you could not fix by getting up before dawn and working harder. She came into the kitchen. She sat at the table. He finished the dishes and dried his hands and poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot that was still warm and sat down across from her, and neither of them said anything for a long moment, and the fire in the stove ticked and settled. "You do not have to do the dishes," she said finally, which was not what she had meant to say at all. "I know," he said. "I am not sure what to do with you," she said, which was much closer to what she actually meant. He looked at her. His eyes were serious and steady, and there was something in them that he was not hiding but that he was also not pressing, as if he understood that she needed to arrive at things on her own schedule. "I am not going anywhere," he said. It was so simple. It was such a simple thing to say. But Emma Wilcox had been alone for 5 years, widowed at 22, arrived in Kansas at 27 with nothing but a deed and a determination, and no one in all that time had said to her in that way, quietly and plainly, without theater, "I am not going anywhere." She looked at the table. She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. She thought about her husband James, who had been a good man and who had died of a fever in the winter of 1882, and whom she had loved in the ordinary, uncomplicated way you love someone you have known since childhood, which is real love but not the same as what she felt moving in her now, uncomfortable and bright and absolutely inconvenient. "We have known each other for 4 days," she said. "5, counting the grain exchange," he said. She looked up sharply, and he was almost smiling just at the corners, and she found that she was almost smiling back, which was also inconvenient. "I am not an easy person," she said. "I have noticed," he said. "I am not inclined toward easy." She was quiet. The fire ticked. Outside, the first hard wind of the real winter moved across the plains with a sound like something being decided. "I would like to see you again," she said, "under circumstances that are not an emergency." "I would like that too," he said. He left an hour later, riding back to the Brennan spread in the dark with the stars bright and cold above the plains. And Emma stood at her door and watched him go and pressed the oilcloth in her apron pocket with 2 fingers, and thought about evidence, and what it meant to push things, and whether a woman alone in Kansas in 1887 had the standing and the resources to hold a powerful man accountable for what he had done to her. She thought about this all night, and by morning she had a plan. She rode to Abilene. It was a day and a half each way by wagon, and she made the trip in early November with the cold digging into everything and the road rutted and stubborn. She went to the offices of the Abilene Chronicle, where she knew a man named Samuel Pratt who had done a story on Kansas women homesteaders 2 years earlier, and who had shown, in that story, a genuine interest in the harder edges of frontier justice. Samuel Pratt was 40 and sandy-haired, and had the permanent, slightly disheveled look of a man whose mind moved faster than his surroundings could keep up with. He listened to her for 40 minutes without interruption, which told her he was taking her seriously. "I cannot print accusations without proof," he said when she finished. "I know that," she said. "What I need is someone who knows how to find the proof, and I believe I have a piece of the oilcloth." She showed him the cloth. He leaned over it with the focused attention of a man who understood exactly what he was looking at. "Hartley and Sons Supply," he said. "Yes," she said. "There are 2 stores in Cedar County carrying Hartley goods. One of them has a direct social connection to Fletcher Crane." Samuel Pratt sat back in his chair and pressed his fingertips together. "There is a territorial land investigator named McAllister who has been looking at Cedar County for 6 months. He has not been getting much cooperation locally." Emma felt the sharp, bright feeling again, cleaner this time. "How do I reach him?" "You don't," Pratt said, "but I do. Give me a week." She gave him a week. She went home. She mended fences and managed her cattle and checked the hay stack twice daily and wrote careful letters and waited, which was the hardest part of being a practical person, because waiting required a kind of faith that practicality did not easily accommodate. Cornelius came by 4 times in that week. The first time, he brought her a new fence post for the south line, where one of Crane's men had clearly been leaning on the old one, and they mended it together in the cold, with their breath making small clouds in the air between them. The second time, he brought her information he had gathered carefully at the grain exchange, where Curtis Hale had let slip, in the comfortable way that people let things slip when they think you are not relevant to their concerns, that a large order of Hartley goods had been placed in late October and had included a significant quantity of oilcloth. The third time he came by, it was in the evening, and he brought nothing except himself, and she made coffee and they sat by the fire and talked. They talked about the things that people talk about when they are finding out who someone actually is. The parents who had shaped them and the choices that had formed them, and the things they believed about the world with enough conviction to act on. Cornelius had grown up in Missouri, the son of a farmer who had worked himself absolutely thin for ground that the bank had eventually taken in the drought of 1860. He had left at 17 to find his own way, and had spent the better part of 15 years doing exactly that, with all the rough education that implied. He believed, he said quietly, that land belonged to the people who worked it, not the people who had the most money to place beside it or the most connections to protect it, but the people who got up before dawn and put their hands into the soil and carried the thing forward day by day. He said this without rhetoric, as a statement of simple conviction, and Emma listened with something that was not just agreement but recognition, the specific recognition of someone hearing their own deepest belief articulated clearly by another person for the first time. "My husband James believed the same thing," she said. Cornelius was quiet, respectful of the name entering the room. "He died in the winter of 1882, she said. "Fever. We had been married 3 years. "I am sorry," he said. "I came to Kansas because the deed was in both our names, and when James died the land still had to be worked. I did not know how to stop and I did not have anywhere else to go, and so I stayed and learned." "You did more than that," he said. "I was very angry for the first year," she said. "I do not think I have told anyone that before, but I was furious at everything, at James for dying, which was not fair to him, at the land for being hard, at the men who assumed I would fail." She looked at the fire. "I am less angry now, but I do not think I am sorry that I was angry then. I think it kept me moving. I think you would have moved regardless," he said. "I think that is who you are." She looked at him. He was watching her with an expression that she could not fully name, though its components were clear enough. Attentiveness, and something warmer than that, and behind it a steadiness that she had come to understand was not passivity but the opposite, the kind of steadiness that comes from knowing exactly what you want and being willing to wait for the right moment. The 4th time he came by that week, it was the day the letter arrived from Samuel Pratt. McAllister, the territorial land investigator, was coming to Harlow Creek. He had been building a case against Fletcher Crane for illegal land acquisition practices for 6 months, and what he needed was a direct witness with physical evidence and a willingness to stand behind it in a formal proceeding. Emma's oilcloth, combined with the purchase records at Curtis Hale's store that McAllister had authority to subpoena, combined with a pattern of documented interference that 3 other small landowners in Cedar County were now willing to come forward about, was the missing piece. Emma read the letter twice. Then she sat down, which was unusual for her. Cornelius, who had been in the kitchen drinking coffee when the writer had brought the letter, came to the doorway and looked at her. "Good news or bad?" he asked. She looked up. She felt something in her face that was close to amazement. "He has been building a case for 6 months, she said. "I was not the first." "No," Cornelius said. "People like Crane rarely stop at one. But I might be the one who tips it over." "Yes," he said. "You might." She stood up. She folded the letter carefully. She put it in the same pocket where she kept the oilcloth. "I need to write back to Pratt tonight," she said. "Write to him," Cornelius said. "I will make supper." She stopped. She looked at him in the doorway of her kitchen. This man who had shown up with his sleeves rolled up and his quiet efficiency and his utter lack of pretense. This man who had picked up her pencil at the grain exchange and handed it back without being asked, and who had come back 4 times in a week for no reason that could be called professional, and for every reason that could be called personal. And she felt the thing that had been moving in her since the second evening of hay cutting arrive fully and without any remaining possibility of being called something else. "Cornelius," she said. He looked at her. "I think," she said carefully, "that I would like you to stay." He was very still for a moment. "For supper," he said, and there was just enough of that not quite smile at the corners of his mouth that she knew he understood exactly what she meant. "Longer than supper," she said. He set down his coffee cup. He crossed the room and he stood in front of her, close enough that she had to look up slightly, and his hands came up to frame her face with a gentleness that was at odds with how capable she knew those hands to be, and he said, "I told you I was not going anywhere." He kissed her very softly, as if he was asking a question, and she kissed him back with the same certainty with which she did everything, which was her answer. The proceeding with McAllister took place in early December. It was not a trial in the formal sense, not yet, but an official investigative hearing at the Cedar County Courthouse before a federal territorial examiner, which carried a weight that Sheriff Briggs's notebook had never possessed. Emma attended with the oilcloth in her hand and her jaw set, and gave her account with the same clear-eyed precision she applied to everything. 3 other landowners attended and gave their own accounts. McAllister presented the purchase records from Curtis Hale's store, which had been subpoenaed, and which showed quite clearly that a specific order of Hartley oilcloth had been placed by Fletcher Crane's ranch manager on the 23rd of October, 8 days before Emma's haystack burned. Fletcher Crane attended with a lawyer from Topeka, and a face that was composed and careful in the way of a man who still believed the situation could be managed. By the end of the day, that composure had developed cracks. The territorial examiner recommended formal charges. The charges would move to a district court proceeding in the spring. In the meantime, a cease and desist order was issued against Fletcher Crane with regard to any contact with Emma Wilcox or her property, which had the force of federal authority behind it in a way that even the most locally connected man in Cedar County could not simply ignore. Emma walked out of the courthouse into the cold December air and stood on the wooden sidewalk and breathed. The sky was the pale blue of deep winter, clear and enormous above the flat Kansas plain. Cornelius was waiting on the steps. He had not testified because he had not been present for any of the specific acts in question, and his testimony would have been indirect. But he had been in the building all day. "How are you?" he asked. "I am well," she said, and then more honestly, "I am shaking." He offered his arm. She took it, which was not something she did easily or often, and they walked down the main street of Harlow Creek together, which they had not done before in the full public view of the town, and she was aware of eyes from the storefronts, and she did not particularly care. Beatrice Halford was waiting for them at the end of the street by absolute coincidence, which was to say by design, because Beatrice's memory for the dates of important events was precise. She looked at Emma's face, and then at Emma's hand on Cornelius's arm, and her expression was one of complete satisfaction. "Well," she said. "Charges recommended," Emma said. Beatrice's eyes went bright. "And the other matter," she said, looking quite deliberately between Emma and Cornelius. "That matter is also proceeding favorably," Emma said, in a tone that was supposed to discourage further inquiry and completely failed. "I knew it," Beatrice said, as if she had bet money. She took Emma's free hand in both of hers and squeezed it once, firmly, the way women who have lived long enough to know the value of things acknowledge them when they arrive. Christmas came the way Christmas always came on the Kansas plains, quietly and with cold that had teeth and a beauty that was spare and serious rather than pretty. Emma's cattle were thriving. The haystack was holding. The house was warm, and she had enough put by to make it through spring without difficulty, and the knowledge that the legal proceeding against Fletcher Crane was moving forward, slowly but with federal weight behind it, gave her a quality of peace she had not had since the morning she found the burned ruins of her original stack. Cornelius had given his notice to Tom Brennan, who had accepted it with genuine regret and had shaken his hand and wished him well, and had given Emma, when she next saw him at the grain exchange, a look of such straightforward satisfaction that she had laughed out loud, which surprised them both. He moved into the small bunkhouse on Emma's property, which was entirely appropriate for 1887, and which satisfied the sensibilities of the town while being, as a practical matter, a 10-minute walk from the main house, which Cornelius made at least once a day in each direction. He put his few possessions in the bunkhouse and his considerable skills to work on Emma's property, the dozen small repairs and improvements that a working ranch always needed, and that Emma had been carrying alone for 4 years. He replaced 3 fence sections. He weatherproofed the barn. He fixed the well mechanism that had been sticky since September. He did all of this with the same quiet, focused competence he brought to everything, and without a single moment of taking over or second-guessing Emma's decisions about what was her land and how it should be run. He offered opinions when she asked for them, and sometimes when she did not, because he was not a man without views, but he offered them as a person offers something that the other person can take or leave, and Emma appreciated this more than she would have known how to say directly. She said it indirectly, which was her way of saying most things that mattered. She left coffee on the stove for him in the mornings. She asked for his opinion on the South Pasture rotation schedule, which she had already decided, but which she genuinely wanted his view on. She saved the good biscuits for the evenings he stayed for supper. He came to understand her language the way you come to understand the language of a person you are paying real attention to. And she came to understand his, the weight of his silences, and the precise meaning of the small shifts in his expression that were his equivalent of what other people said out loud. They were building something between them that was not yet named, but that was as real as the haystack and considerably more durable. January brought snow. Real snow, the kind that blanketed the plains and muffled the world, and made the distances between things feel enormous in a way that could be oppressive or beautiful, depending on your relationship with solitude. Emma had always found it beautiful. She had spent 4 winters being the only person for a considerable radius who did not mind the silence, and she still found it beautiful. But she noticed that winter with Cornelius at the table, and the fire going, and the lamp turned up against the early dark, was a different quality of beautiful than the winter she had spent alone. One evening in late January, with snow coming down outside the kitchen window in the particular straight, unhurried way it comes down when it is very serious about accumulating, they were sitting at the table with the remains of supper between them, and she was reading a letter from Samuel Pratt, and he was repairing a buckle on one of the harnesses. Ordinary domestic industry. The kind of evening that was entirely unremarkable and that she was aware, with a clarity that startled her, she would remember for the rest of her life. She put down the letter. "Pratt says the district court date is set for April," she said. "Good," he said, not looking up from the buckle. "He thinks the other witnesses are solid. He thinks Crane's lawyer knows they are losing ground." "Crane probably knows it too by now," Cornelius said. "Men like that can feel when the architecture shifts." "Are you worried about him?" she asked. He looked up then. "About what he might do in the meantime?" "Yes." He set down the harness. He thought about it with the honest attention he gave real questions. "He is constrained by the federal order," he said. "He is also smart enough to know that any further action against you would confirm everything McAllister is already building. He is in a position where the best move he can make is to do nothing." "That is what I thought too," she said. "I just wanted to know if you saw it the same way." He studied her for a moment. "Do you trust my assessment?" "Yes," she said simply, "I do." Something in his expression shifted with a warmth that he did not try to conceal. He picked the harness back up. She went back to the letter. The snow fell straight and serious outside the window. A few minutes later he said, without looking up, "Emma." "Yes. I would like to ask you to marry me." He said this in the same tone he used for everything. Direct, unhurried, entirely serious. "Not tonight, necessarily. I am raising it now so that you have time to think about it, because I know that is how you prefer to approach significant decisions." She put the letter down again. He was still looking at the harness buckle, which she understood was not indifference but the opposite, the particular brand of careful that meant this mattered to him more than almost anything. "Cornelius," she said. He looked up. "I have been thinking about it since November," she said. His eyes were very still for a moment. And yes," she said. "Obviously yes." He set the harness down for the second time, and he looked at her across the table, with an expression she had never seen on his face before, open in a way that nothing had been before, as though a door had come off its hinges entirely. He got up and came around the table, and she stood to meet him, and he held her the way he did everything, thoroughly and with complete attention, and she pressed her face against his shoulder and felt the realness of him, the warmth and solidity of a man who had said he was not going anywhere and meant it with every fiber. They were married in March, on a Saturday that began cold and gray and ended with pale winter sun coming through the clouds, which Beatrice Halford declared was a sign, and which Emma privately thought was March doing what March always did. The ceremony was at the Harlow Creek Church, performed by Reverend Cole, who was a practical man who kept the word straightforward and the ceremony to a sensible length, both of which suited the parties being married. Beatrice was there, and Tom Brennan and Marcus and Samuel Pratt had ridden from Abilene, which touched Emma more than she showed. There were others from the town who had come to respect Emma Wilcox in the years since she had arrived with her deed and her determination. People who had started by being curious about whether she would fail and ended by being quietly glad she had not. Cornelius wore a clean dark jacket that fit him well and had his hair brushed and looked, Emma thought, exactly like himself but elevated, the way a good piece of land looks after the first good rain. She wore a dress that Beatrice had helped her make from blue-gray wool that was the color of Cornelius's eyes in certain lights, which was not coincidental. She had made this decision on her own and told no one, and it gave her a private satisfaction that was entirely characteristic. When Reverend Cole asked her if she took this man, she said yes with a certainty that rang in the small church like a bell that had been waiting to be struck. When the ceremony was done and the gathered people had offered their hands and their good words, Cornelius leaned down and said quietly against her ear, "You look like you have just signed the most important deed of your life." "I have," she said. He laughed. It was a real laugh, unguarded, and she felt it against her side where his arm was around her, and thought that she wanted to hear that sound for as long as she lived. The district court proceedings in April went exactly as McAllister and Pratt had predicted. The evidence against Fletcher Crane was substantial, and the witnesses were, as Pratt had said, solid. Curtis Hale had made a separate arrangement with the federal examiner that involved providing testimony in exchange for a reduced accounting for his own role, which had not been criminal exactly, but which was close enough to uncomfortable that cooperation was the sensible choice. Fletcher Crane's Topeka lawyer was skilled, but the evidence was what it was, and what it was clear. Crane was found liable for the destruction of Emma's property, and for a pattern of intimidation and interference against 4 landholders in Cedar County, which collectively represented a significant portion of the neighboring property he had been attempting to absorb by attrition. The court ordered restitution to all 4 landholders and imposed restrictions on Crane's land acquisition activities in Cedar County for a period of 5 years, with federal oversight. It was not a prison sentence, which frustrated Emma, though she understood that the law did what it could do with what it had. What it had was enough to protect her land and the land of her neighbors, and enough to make Fletcher Crane a man who had to think carefully before he made another move of this kind. She walked out of the Harlow Creek courthouse that April afternoon into warm spring air that smelled of new grass, with Cornelius beside her and Beatrice on her other side, and Samuel Pratt, who had stayed for the verdict, clapping his sandy-haired hands together in satisfaction. "There it is," Pratt said. "That is how it ought to work." "It took long enough," Emma said, but there was no bitterness in it. She was looking at the green that was coming up in the fields at the edge of town, the reliable annual miracle of Kansas spring, and she was thinking about her south pasture and the cattle that were fat and well-fed from a winter that had been exactly as hard as the sky had promised and exactly as survivable as she had planned. "Are you satisfied?" Cornelius asked her. She considered the question seriously. "Yes," she said. "I am satisfied. Not perfectly satisfied because I think he should face a harder consequence, but satisfied. That is about as good as it gets," he said. "For now," she said, "I will take for now." He put his arm around her. She leaned into him, just slightly, just enough. It was the kind of gesture that meant something different now than it would have meant 6 months ago, both more comfortable and more full. Spring on the Wilcox Collier ranch, as it was now registered at the county land office in Cornelius's careful script below Emma's name, was the best season Emma had experienced in Kansas. It might have been the factual circumstances, the legal victory and the flourishing cattle and the sound finances. But she believed it was also simply the quality of the season itself, when you were not carrying it alone. Cornelius planted a kitchen garden along the south side of the house with a precision and attention to soil that impressed her. He expanded the chicken run. He made arrangements with a new feed supplier that saved her $12 over the summer, which he mentioned to her as simple information and not as evidence of his own usefulness, and which she appreciated on both counts. They had been married 4 months when Emma told him, one June morning over the breakfast she had made with the early garden vegetables, that they were going to have a child. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she had seen before only briefly, on the night in January when she had said yes, that same unguarded openness that was his deepest register. "When?" he asked. "January, I think," she said. "Perhaps February." He reached across the table and took her hand in both of his, and held it there, and did not say anything for a long moment, and she looked at their hands together on the table, his large and calloused and capable, her small and equally calloused, and she thought about the year that had brought her from standing alone in the dark watching a haystack burn to this kitchen in June with everything growing, and this man's hands around hers. "I am glad," he said finally. "So am I," she said, "though I want to be clear that the ranch work schedule is not going to change substantially until December." He smiled. "I would not have suggested otherwise." "I know," she said. "I know you wouldn't." The summer of 1888 was long and warm and generous, the kind of Kansas summer that made you forgive the winters retroactively. Emma's cattle were doing well. The kitchen garden was exceptional. Cornelius's doing mostly, though he attributed it to the soil. Beatrice Halford came by twice a week, and was so happy about the coming baby that she had begun knitting before Emma had reached 4 months, which made Emma feel observed in a manner that was excessive and entirely welcome. She worked through the summer with the adjustment she had told Cornelius she would make, which was not much adjustment at all until August, when the heat and her expanding shape required some concessions she made without particular grace. Cornelius noted these concessions and made his own adjustments around them so smoothly that she rarely felt accommodated, only accompanied, which was exactly the right way to do it, and which she knew had not been accidental. In September they had a visitor she had not expected. A young woman named Clara Hendricks arrived at the gate on foot, which was unusual, carrying a cloth bag and looking exhausted and frightened and very young, not more than 19 or 20. Emma was in the yard when she arrived and opened the gate herself. Clara Hendricks was the daughter of one of the other landholders who had testified against Fletcher Crane, a man named Roy Hendricks who farmed 20 miles south. She explained in a shaking voice while Emma sat her down at the kitchen table with water and food, working as a domestic at the house of a man in a neighboring county whose conduct toward her had been increasingly threatening, and she had left without notice 3 days earlier and had been walking and riding with strangers and was trying to reach her father. Emma listened to all of this and looked at the girl's thin wrists and frightened eyes and said, "You will stay here tonight. Tomorrow Cornelius will drive you to your father." Clara Hendricks began to cry with relief, which produced in Emma a complicated sensation that included the memory of her own first winter in Kansas, when she had been more frightened than she had admitted to anyone, and had also had nowhere to go but forward. Cornelius drove Clara to her father the next day. He returned that evening and reported that Roy Hendricks was well and the reunion had been complete, and that Roy had sent Emma a basket of late tomatoes, which was sitting on the wagon seat. "Good man," Emma said, bringing the tomatoes inside. "He asked how you were," Cornelius said, unsaddling the horse. "I told him well and expecting." "What did he say?" "He said Emma Wilcox was the best kind of woman and that Kansas needed more of her." Emma paused with the tomatoes in her hands. "He said Wilcox," she said. "I may have corrected him," Cornelius said, and there was the not-quite smile. "What did you tell him?" "I told him her name was Collier now," he said, "and that Kansas was welcome to more of her as long as it understood she was mine." Emma set down the tomatoes. She looked at him across the yard, this man who had shown up 4 days after a fire and said he was not going anywhere, who had kept that promise through every version of the year that had followed. "That is a very presumptuous thing to say," she told him. "Yes," he agreed. "Are you offended?" She thought about it for exactly 1 second. "No," she said. "Come inside. Supper is almost ready." The baby came in February, as predicted, in the deep cold of a Kansas winter that was indeed hard and that was entirely survivable. They had built the new haystack the previous autumn with a week to spare, Emma working alongside Cornelius until the cold had finally required her to direct from a closer distance rather than participate directly, which she had managed with moderate grace. The stack was solid and the cattle were well, and the house was warm. The birth was attended by the midwife, Martha Yates, a competent and no-nonsense woman who had delivered half the children in Cedar County, and who managed the process with a calm authority that Emma respected enormously. Cornelius waited in the main room, which was the appropriate place for a husband to wait in 1888, and the sounds from the bedroom would have alarmed a less steady man, but Cornelius sat in the chair by the fire and did not move for 4 hours, and when Martha Yates opened the door and said it was over and both were well, he came into the doorway and looked at Emma in the bed with the infant in her arms, and his face did the thing that Emma had seen it do twice before, open all the way to the foundation. "A boy," Martha Yates said from behind him. Cornelius came to the bedside. He sat carefully on the edge and looked at his son, who was very small and very red and had the specific concentrated expression of a person who has just accomplished something enormous and is not yet sure what to make of the world. He reached out and touched the baby's hand with one finger very gently. "James," Emma said, "if you agree." He looked at her. He understood. "James," he said. She leaned her head back against the pillow and looked at her husband and her son in the lamplight of the February bedroom, and felt the kind of peace that is not the absence of difficulty, but the presence of everything that makes difficulty worth surviving. Young James Collier was a serious baby and a determined child, which surprised no one who knew his parents. He crawled at 7 months and walked at 10 months, and by the time he was 2 years old, he was following Cornelius through the barn with an expression of intense focus that made Beatrice Halford say he was the image of his mother crossed with something mountain solid, which was accurate on both counts. The district court's restrictions on Fletcher Crane held through the 5 years they were imposed. Crane himself became a quieter figure in Cedar County over those years, the kind of powerful man who has had the edges of his power clearly marked and who has learned the cost of crossing those marks. He sold 2 of his outer properties in 1890 and moved a portion of his operations to a neighboring county, which was a significant reduction in local pressure that the small landholders in Cedar County felt as a collective easing. Emma noted his reduced presence with satisfaction and moved on. She had other things to manage. The ranch grew, not dramatically, not in the manner of empire building, but steadily and well. They added 20 acres to the east in 1890 when the Pritchard family moved on, buying the parcel at a fair price and expanding their cattle operation accordingly. Cornelius negotiated a standing arrangement with a beef buyer in Abilene that gave them a predictable price through the seasons, which was worth more than many people understood because predictability in the cattle market was as valuable as the cattle themselves. Emma kept the books with the same precise attention she had always brought to numbers, and the books told a story that she found deeply satisfying. A ranch that was not rich but was absolutely sound, managed by people who understood it from the ground up, and who had no debt they could not service and no dependency on the goodwill of men who did not mean them well. In the autumn of 1891, their second child arrived. A daughter this time, who came into the world in October with the same efficiency and certainty that characterized her mother's approach to most endeavors. They named her Ruth, after Cornelius's mother, who had died when he was 12, and whom he had spoken of a handful of times with a quality of memory that Emma recognized as a still, clean grief, the kind that has been carried long enough to become part of the landscape rather than an obstacle in it. Ruth Collier arrived in October, and immediately commenced a campaign to ensure that no room she occupied was ever quiet for long. She was the opposite of her brother James in this respect. Where James was concentrated and watchful, Ruth was expansive and communicative, and the house on the Kansas plain that had once been entirely quiet was now, in the evenings, the kind of house that sounds like what home is supposed to sound like, with the voices of children and the fire and the particular mix of ordinary happiness that Emma had not planned for and had received anyway. James took his role as older sibling with complete seriousness. He taught Ruth how to collect eggs from the chicken coop when she was 2 and he was 3, which involved a level of patience in a 3-year-old that impressed even Emma, who had high standards for patience. Cornelius watched his children with a quality of attention that was quiet and deep, and that Emma recognized as the same quality of attention he had always given everything he valued, and she loved him for it in the way that you love someone not just for who they are, but for who they show themselves to be consistently, over time, in the unremarkable daily evidence that is more convincing than any declaration. Beatrice Halford remained a fixture in their lives through all of it. She was 70 now and her hip was worse, but she drove herself over twice a week with the same determination and arrived with bread or preserves or simply herself, which was the most valuable offering, and she sat with Emma at the kitchen table while the children played in the yard, and they talked about the things that women who have known each other for nearly a decade talk about, which is everything. One afternoon in the autumn of 1892, with Ruth in her lap and James visible through the window chasing a very patient chicken around the yard, Beatrice said, "You know what I remember most about the night of the fire?" Emma looked up from the mending in her hands. "What?" "How you looked when you came back inside," Beatrice said. "I came by the next morning early because I had seen the smoke and I was worried. You were at the table with that piece of paper and you were making your list. Your hair smelled of smoke and your feet were cut and you were making a list." Beatrice shook her head slowly. "I thought then, this woman is not going to be beaten by anything. But I also thought, this woman is carrying everything alone, and I did not know how much longer that could go on without cost." Emma was quiet, listening. "And then you brought home that man," Beatrice said. "And I watched you two in the field for about 20 minutes on the second day, and I went home and I told Harold, may he rest. I said, 'Harold, she is going to be all right.'" Emma put down her mending. She looked out the window at the yard where James had finally caught the chicken and was examining it with scholarly interest. "I was so angry that night," she said. "At the fire. At Crane. At 4 years of being pushed at and not being able to push back in any way that made a difference." "I know," Beatrice said. "I was also frightened," Emma said. "I did not know if I could do it in time, and I did not know if I could keep doing it alone. And now—" Emma looked at the yard and then at the woman across the table from her. "Now I am not alone," she said. "And there is a great deal of difference." Beatrice nodded. Ruth made a contented sound in her lap. Outside, James had set the chicken down and was now explaining something to it with evident conviction. The afternoon light was long and gold across the Kansas plain, the particular light of autumn that made everything look as if it had been rendered in the best possible version of itself. The haystack in the south field was full. It had been full every November since the one Cornelius Collier had helped her build in 4 days against the frost, and it would be full again next November, because that was what you did on a working ranch in Kansas, and because that was who they were. Cornelius came in from the barn as the light was going, stamping the dust from his boots on the step. He came into the kitchen and saw Beatrice, and nodded a greeting and saw Emma, and the something in his face that was always there when he saw her, warm and specific and not performed, the expression of a man who has found the thing that is worth staying for, and every day confirms the judgment. He got himself a cup of coffee and settled at the table, and they talked, the 3 of them, about nothing of consequence, the cattle and the weather and the state of the east fence and what James had done with the chicken. Ruth fell asleep in Beatrice's arms. James came in from the yard with dust on his knees, and a detailed report on the temperament of the chicken, which he delivered to Cornelius with the earnest precision of a 7-year-old who takes all information seriously. Cornelius listened with full attention and asked a question about the chicken that was so considered and sincere that James's face lit up with the specific joy of being taken seriously. And Emma watched this from across the table and felt something move through her that was so large and simple that she had no name for it except the one she had been slow to apply to herself, and now could not imagine being without. Happy. She was happy, not in the uncomplicated way of a person who has not known difficulty. In the way of a person who has known precisely what can be lost and what it costs to hold on to the things that matter, and who has chosen to do the work, and has found that the work was worth it. Beatrice left as the dark came on, driving herself home the way she always did, refusing any offer of escort with the same cheerful certainty she had always refused assistance she did not need. Emma watched her go from the gate and then came back inside where Cornelius had put the children to bed and the fire was stoked, and the kitchen was quiet with the good quiet of a house that has been full and is now settling. She sat down across from him with her coffee. He looked at her. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. She considered the question. "The night of the fire," she said. "Beatrice was talking about it today." He nodded. "I keep thinking about the boot print in the frost," she said. "How clear it was, how there was something almost clarifying about it, like all the suspicion I had carried for 4 years suddenly had a shape." "Rage can be clarifying," he said. "Yes," she said, "but it was more than that. It was the moment when I understood that I could not do what needed doing alone." She looked at him. "I had never admitted that to myself before, about anything." "It is a hard thing to admit," he said. "For some people more than others," she said, and they both understood she was talking about herself. "I went to you because you were the last name on my list, and because you had handed me a pencil without being asked, and because Tom Brennan said you were steady." She paused. "I did not go to you because I thought you would change my life." "And yet," he said. "And yet," she agreed. He reached across the table and touched her hand, not taking it, just touching it, the way he had always communicated the things that were too large for the economy of words he naturally preferred. She turned her hand over and held his. Outside the window, the Kansas plain was dark under a sky full of stars so clear and cold and numerous that they looked, as they always did in the deep Kansas night, like something that had been poured out in abundance by a hand that did not know the meaning of shortage. The ranch was quiet. The cattle were settled. The hay was stacked and covered against what was coming, as it always was now, as it would always be, because that was the promise she had made to herself on the night of the fire, and kept with the help of the man across the table, the man who had said he was not going anywhere, and had meant it in every way that a man can mean the truest thing he has ever said. Emma Wilcox Collier looked at her husband in the lamplight of the kitchen that had become their kitchen, in the house that had become their house, on the land that was in both their names, and that no one who wanted it was going to take from them. She was 31 years old. She had been a widow and a solitary fighter, and a woman who made lists against disaster, and who had stood in front of a burning haystack in her nightgown, and refused to stop moving. She was also a wife and a mother, and the keeper of a ranch that was sound and growing and hers, deeply and legally and permanently hers. She was not alone. She looked at Cornelius and he looked back, and the fire ticked in the stove, and the children slept, and the stars burned cold and clear above the Kansas plain, and everything that needed to be resolved was resolved, and everything that needed to be built had been built, and there was more building still to come, which was not a threat but a promise, and they both knew it, and neither of them was afraid. In the spring of 1894, they broke new ground on the north section that they had left fallow for 2 years. James, now 9, worked beside his father with a seriousness that made Cornelius look at Emma, sometimes with an expression that was pure, uncomplicated wonder. Ruth, 3 and determined and loud about everything, supervised from the fence rail with opinions that were numerous and specific. Emma stood at the edge of the newly turned earth and looked at her family and at her land and at the sky above Kansas that was the particular blue of early April, full of possibility and light, and she thought about a woman who had arrived with a deed and a determination and nothing else, and what she had made of it. She had made this. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. The years went on, as years do, each one adding its particular evidence to the story that a life builds without meaning to. The way a river builds a canyon, not in any single moment but in the faithful, daily, apparently unremarkable fact of its persistence. Fletcher Crane's name grew quieter in Cedar County and eventually became just a name, attached to a man who had been reduced to ordinary scale by the ordinary workings of consequence. Emma paid the name less and less attention, until finally she paid it no attention at all, which is the best possible outcome when the name belongs to someone who wanted to undo you. The ranch added another 30 acres in 1896, bringing them to 210 in total, which was a real operation now, the kind that made sensible people look up when it was mentioned at market. Cornelius had become a recognized figure in Cedar County not because he sought it, but because he worked with the same quality of attention in public as in private, and people who watched that long enough came to trust it. Marcus Brennan, grown now into a capable young rancher himself, came by to ask for advice on a cattle deal in the autumn of that year, which marked a particular turning of something that Emma noticed. Tom Brennan, who came with Marcus, sat at her kitchen table and accepted her coffee and said to Cornelius with genuine feeling, "The best thing that ever came out of my ranch was the fact that you left it." Cornelius looked at Emma when this was said. She was not looking at him, but she was smiling just slightly, and he knew she had heard. Their third child, born in the autumn of 1897, was another boy, a loud, copper-haired infant who arrived in September and announced himself immediately as a person of strong preferences. They named him Samuel, for Samuel Pratt of the Abilene Chronicle, who had been the first person with the tools and the willingness to help her build a case out of an oilcloth and a boot print, and a fury she had been carrying for 4 years. Pratt himself made the ride from Abilene when he heard the news, arriving in October with a bottle of something decent and a broad sandy-haired grin. He held the baby with the slightly alarmed competence of a man who does not normally hold babies and said, "Well, he looks like a newspaper man. He looks like a troublemaker," Cornelius said. "As I said," Pratt agreed. Emma took her son back and held him against her chest and looked around the kitchen at the people gathered there. Cornelius at the stove, Pratt at the table, James doing his lessons in the corner with his father's concentrated expression on his 9-year-old face, Ruth commandeering Pratt's hat from the hook by the door and trying it on with complete satisfaction, and little Samuel making the small, certain sounds of a person who intends to make his presence known. She thought about lists made in the dark and boot prints in the frost, and the name she had not spoken for months that had risen to her lips like something she already knew. She thought about a man who handed back a pencil without being asked and showed up at 4:15 in the morning and washed the dishes without being asked and said, "I am not going anywhere," with the simple certainty of a person who has no reason to say anything other than the truth. She thought about all of this, and she thought also about how strangely the essential things arrive, not when you plan for them and not when you deserve them exactly, but when you have been doing the work long enough and seriously enough that you have become the kind of person the right things can find. Outside the kitchen window of the ranch house on the Kansas plain, the October wind moved through the grass of the south field where the haystack stood, already built, already covered, already enough. The cattle in the pasture were fat and unbothered. The sky was the good October blue that comes between the heat and the hard cold, the blue of things that are neither over nor beginning but fully, presently themselves. Emma Wilcox Collier held her youngest son and watched her family in the warm kitchen and was at peace with all of it, the difficult past and the present richness and the future that was not guaranteed, but was solidly, practically, lovingly arranged. The rival had burned her haystack before the first frost. The cowboy who had helped her rebuild had said he was not going anywhere, and he never had. And that was the whole of it, and it was more than enough, and it was true.